So let's start chapter 12 here, looking at the origin and diversification of life on Earth. So we're going to start off looking at what a species is. Now here, Cristiano Ronaldo and Kerry Washington don't look all that different to me, but we're all of the same species here. Whereas these are showing that these two flowers here, the Persian buttercup and the pink rose, this high view on them, they look fairly similar, but they're different species. And same with orangutan and also the golden lion tamarins. Now, these guys, even on this picture, they look kind of similar. They're very different in size. Tamarins are about this big, where orangutans are, much, much larger. So, anyway, so what it's saying is, even though things may look similar, they're probably a different species. Okay? So, what a species is. This is a group of actually or potentially interbreeding natural populations which are reproductively isolated from other such groups. All right? And so that's what we're looking at there. They're reproductively isolated from other groups. So, when we say actually, they are interbreeding, or potentially, if we put two different populations together, they could interbreed. So reindeer in Europe and Asia is the same species as caribou in North America. Now, obviously, they are separated by an ocean, but if they could get together, they could interbreed. So they are the same species. All right, so let's look at reproductive isolating mechanisms, because that's really what the main key is here to what a species is. So this is any structural, functional, or behavioral characteristic that prevents successful reproduction from occurring. All right? Now, two major ways that this can occur. This is either through pre-mating isolating mechanisms or post-mating isolating mechanisms. So let's look at pre-mating isolating mechanisms, and these are going to prevent reproduction attempts. All right? So one is just geographical isolation. So here, two species live in different locations. So this is showing a spotted owl, which is found in the Pacific Northwest, and then this is a barred owl, which is found around here. So these two species, even though they look fairly similar, they're found in different areas of the United States, and so they don't reproduce with each other. All right? Next is, so here's showing another example. These are two ground squirrels or chipmunks found on either side of the Grand Canyon. And because the Grand Canyon separates those two populations, they can't interbreed either. All right, next is ecological isolation. And here, two species live in the same area, but in different habitats. And this is showing a couple of garter snakes or ribbon snakes. One lives in a swampy area, one does not. And so because they live in different areas, they don't reproduce with each other. Once again, sort of like ecological, geographical isolation, just not as far apart from each other. Next is behavioral isolation. And this is differences in courtship behavior that allow males and females to recognize each other. And so what we see with a lot of birds is birds will make these bird calls, attracting females to them. So males will. This is showing a blue-footed booby. This is a type of bird that the male does a courtship dance. And then the female, based upon his dance, she might go, oh, he dances well enough, I will mate with him. All right? So, but this is what all bird calls and frog calls are. They're trying to find mates. And why they're so important, especially for frogs, is frogs don't have really good eyesight. And so the male frog will call, and any other frog that comes into their area, they'll try to mate with it. That's why it's very important that only their females of the same species show up. Next is temporal isolation. So temporal isolation here, is where species reproduce in different seasons or in different times of the day. So this picture right here is trying to show, hey, some reproduce at night, some during the day. So this separates the different species from each other. All right. Next is mechanical isolation. So mechanical isolation is where the genitalia are unsuitable for one another. All right. So they don't match up. So here this is showing a couple of different snails that look very similar to us. But if you look at their shells, you're seeing their shells are a little different from each other. So this one opens up to the left side, and this is a left-handed snail. This one does not open to the left side, it opens to the right side, so it winds around this way. And so these species don't reproduce because their genitalia don't match up for them to reproduce with each other. All right, next is a post-mating isolating mechanism. So post-mating isolating mechanisms, these are going to prevent hybrid offspring from developing or breeding. All right, so the first is just gamete isolation. And so here, either the sperm cannot reach the egg or they cannot fuse with the egg to become a zygote. And these are showing a couple different species of sea urchins. And a lot of species that are found in the ocean just release their gametes into the water. So they'll release egg, they'll release sperm, okay? And they do this all like collectively, so predators don't come along and eat all those gametes all at once. But the sperm from one species cannot fuse with the egg of a different species. So that helps that hybrid from developing. Next is zygote mortality. This is if fertilization occurs, so the sperm fuses with the egg, the zygote does not survive. It doesn't develop properly and dies in development. All right. Next is hybrid sterility. Hybrid sterility is where the zygote forms and develops, but the hybrid is sterile and it cannot reproduce. And this is what we see here. Here's a horse and a donkey, and this is a mule. So a mule is a combination between a horse and a donkey. It is sterile, it cannot reproduce. All right. The next picture here is showing a liger. So a liger is a combination between a lion and a tiger. And once again, these are sterile cats as well. Okay. So I think there's another picture of a liger. Yeah, so, all right. The next one is called F2 fitness. And F2 fitness is where the hybrid is fertile, but the F2 hybrid is not. So if you take, so let's say this guy was fertile, matched up with another liger that was fertile, their offspring would not be fertile. All right, so that's F2 fitness there. All right, so let's move on to taxonomy. And taxonomy is a branch of biology concerned with identifying and classifying organisms. So this, so pretty much as long as humans have had higher thought processes, we've been naming species. And one of the problems with the naming species, as I already kind of mentioned here, is that if you're in different areas, you will name a species, you'll give it a different name. So as I mentioned, reindeer in Europe and Asia are the same thing as caribou in North America. And so if you go to a different area, they might have a different name for that organism because they speak a different language. Well, our modern taxonomical system was developed by this guy by the name of Carolus Linnaeus. And he was around the mid to late 1700s. All right? And so he started this classification system that you see up here. Now there have been some modifications to that classification system, all right, over the years. So his top category was kingdom. Ours now is domain, all right. So for him, he classified everything as either being in a plant or an animal. And if it moved, he classified it as an animal, so in the kingdom Animalia. If it was a plant, if it didn't move, he put it in with the kingdom Plantae. All right? So there's obviously been modifications to that. But one of the things we still use of his is the binomial nomenclature. So binomial nomenclature means a two-part naming system. And so that is more commonly known as a scientific name. So for instance, humans are Homo sapiens. All right? The wolf is Canis lupus. Right, the coyote is Canis latrans. So as you notice with the wolf and the coyote, I use the same first word there, Canis. And so that indicates a closer relationship with those organisms. All right. So let's look at the classification for humans. Now this is showing it with the zebra. So in a lot of this, we're going to be fairly similar to the zebra until we get to right about here. All right. So humans, like zebra, are in the domain Eukarya. So Eukarya means that our cells have a nucleus. All right. We are in the kingdom Animalia, Animals move at some point in their life cycle. They are multicellular, and they eat other organisms. All right. We are in the phylum Chordata, so we have a dorsal nerve cord, and there's a few other things associated with that. So dorsal nerve cord, brain, spinal cord. All right. We're in the class Mammalia. So mammals are distinguished by producing hair and being warm-blooded, and also by producing milk for their offspring. All right. We differ with them. We are in the order Primates. So Primates have binocular visions, eyes in the front of their head. They also have opposable thumbs. All right. We are in the family Hominidae, and we are the only living species in the family Hominidae. That is the family of humans. We are the only living ones in the genus Homo. So Homo means human as well. All right. And then our species name, we take our genus name and we take on our species epithet, is what it's called. So we are the species Homo sapiens, and that literally means wise human. All right. So let's look at naming species and why it may not always be easy. So one of the problems with naming a species and how it's not easy is, how do you classify asexual species? Because they don't reproduce, there's no reproductive barrier there that they're trying to overcome. So they don't need to find a mate. So, according to our definition, each one of these guys is its own species. But how we classify asexual reproducing organisms is typically by their structure and their genetic similarities. All right. Next, it's hard to classify fossil species. All right. We just have bones or shells or hard parts, right? And it's hard to see if two organisms were reproductively isolated from each other. All right. So, one of the problems with that is, we all know today that a caterpillar and a butterfly, are of the same group. The caterpillar becomes the butterfly, right? If all those kind of species died off before we were around, and we just had fossils of caterpillars and butterflies, we would probably assume that they were different species from each other, all right? So next, it's hard to determine when one species has evolved or changed into another. So, over the millions of years, if we found this fossil and this fossil, we would say, oh, those are very distinctly different organisms. We're going to name them different things. But if we keep finding intermediates between those, well, it's hard to say, well, this is different from that, okay? Even though this is very different from that, we have all these intermediate steps. So that makes it difficult to identify some species. Next are ring species. So ring species are a group of populations that interbreed, but their geographic extremes of those populations do not. So just kind of like this, but you look at it, instead of over time, you look at like over a mountain range, right? So this group cannot reproduce with that group, but it can interbreed with the groups that are next to it, which can interbreed to the groups next to it, and so on. If all those were to die out, we would say, oh, these two ends here are different, obviously different species from each other. But because we have all these intermediates, it makes it difficult to name them as separate species. So, just a kind of example on this, right? A Chihuahua and a Great Dane are very different from each other. But we're classifying them as all dogs because we have all these other dogs that can interbreed between those two. All right, next is classifying hybridizing species. So hybridization, this is an interbreeding of closely related species. All right, and in this case, the hybrids are fertile. And this is what we can see sometimes between wolves and coyotes, and wolves and dogs, and coyotes and dogs, is that they can interbreed. But what we typically find with wolves and coyotes is they typically don't, and that's because their behaviors are very different from each other. So it's really hard in some situations to go, oh, they're separate species, if they can actually reproduce with each other. So that's why behavior is an important thing to look at as well.